Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name's Kaylee and these are my books. So today's video it should be pretty interesting. It's something new I'm trying out on my channel. So for those of you that don't know, I actually am in the process of completing. I'm in my third year, so I'm not done yet, but I am doing a PhD in English. Therefore, I do have a fair amount of experience with classics. I'm not an expert yet, but I am working to become an expert. And you know, this channel so far has really kept that part of my life outside of the channel. I've only talked about the books that are normally talked about on booktube, you know, the books that I read purely for fun and don't have any research interests in. But I see that some people are interested in classics and really just don't know where to start with classics. And so I wanted to make a video where I basically recommend classics that you might not have heard about talked about as much on booktube. And I think they're entertaining enough to captivate people that aren't used to reading classics, even with an older writing style. So these are books that I think are fun, I think they're entertaining, and I think they're good for beginners that want to read classics but don't have a ton of experience with reading classics and that older style of writing. Now these range from really the 18th century to Victorian era. Sorry, I'm just looking at my stack of books over here because that's where I specialize in. I'm a Victorianist that also has secondary interest in 18th century Gothic literature, and therefore my recommendations will mostly be coming from 18th and 19th century England. So if you are looking for classics that span outside of that genre, I can definitely give you some recommendations. It's just not my specific area of expertise, but I do have experience outside of my specific area. So first, I just want to quickly mention books that get talked about a lot on booktube and outside of booktube. I'm not going to mention them on here because I think everyone pretty much knows about them. So that's Dracula, Frankenstein, and Jane Eyre. Those are all some of my favorite classics ever, and they're so popular for a reason. They're fantastic books. And so any of those would be great for you to pick up. I think they're all entertaining. They're all fairly easy to read. They have good plots. But I'm focusing this video more on books that aren't as well known on booktube. Don't get me wrong, these are classics. They're super well known. You know, I'm not trying to show you like diamonds in the rough here. These are very well known classics. I'm just saying here on booktube, they're not talked about as often. So the first one is maybe the most popular one that I'm going to talk about, and it is John Swift's Gullivers Travels. Of course, there's been movie adaptations of this book, so you've heard of Gullivers Travels before. However, the movie adaptations, shockingly, do not accurately display the contents of this book. This is a very funny and very weird adventure story. This is pure satire, and of course, if you're reading this without doing a ton of research behind the time period, some of the satire is going to go over your head. That's okay, because this is satirizing, you know, the England of its moment, 18th century England, and therefore, if you don't have a ton of knowledge of 18th century English politics, which why would you? You know, you're not going to fully get all of this. However, there's a lot of satire in here that are just satirizing basic human conditions, and therefore, while some of the satire may not land, a lot of it will land. And a lot of it will seem so absurd and so funny. You will be shocked by some of the scenes that are in this book and be like, wow, 18th century was wild. And so basically this is about a traveler that's traveling to all of these crazy destinations. You may be familiar with, you know, Jack Black showing up on a beach and there's tons of like little tiny people all around. That is one of the destinations that this traveler goes to, but he goes to many different destinations, all as wild and wacky as that Lilliput Island. So I recommend this if you want a big adventure story that is funny, wacky, and will shock you with how weird it gets at moments. But overall, this story is pretty easy to follow because, again, we're just following one character going through his travels of all of these unknown islands. The next book I have to recommend is Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. So this is a book where you're gonna be amazed at how cool and how evil this female villain in this story is. I almost said our female hero. She is not a hero, she is a villainess. and she is devious. You want to root for her, but at the same time, the things she's doing, you're like, oh my God, are you really doing that? This will shock you. This is a mystery. I think it would count as a thriller in today's times as well, about domestic Victorian life. This is a Victorian novel, meaning it's both set and written and published in 19th century England. If you aren't familiar with the time period, you don't need to be familiar with the time period. That's okay. This is just an older version of a domestic thriller, and it is fantastic. You may see some of the twists coming, but remember, this possibly was the origin of a lot of these twists that we are familiar with today. But even if you see the twist coming, it's still a very enjoyable story because it's set in this Victorian era, and the way that they do the twists is slightly different than how we today are used to seeing these twists. So even if you're familiar with the twist itself, the way it comes about will shock you. As you can see from the cover of this book is very dramatic. It has a lot of melodrama in there, and it's just one of those books where it falls into the category of female villain, yet maybe you root for her. Maybe she has a reason. The next book I have is the most wild book on this list, okay? But bear with me. It's a ride to read. And that is Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure by John Cleland. And if you know this book, you're probably like, oh my God, this is 18th century pornography. This is the first erotica novel ever written and published, and man, did it cause a stir in society, in 18th century society. So if you're a romance girly, if you like your spicy romance, give this book a try, because this is the 18th century version of spicy romance, and trust me, it does have spice. It has lots of spice in it. And you might think, what is 18th century spice? Well, if you're curious, read this book, check it out, because I promise you, it does not hold back on the spice. So obviously this book, it's not, the plot itself isn't really it, but it's just really entertaining to read these 18th century versions of scenes that you might pick up in a Kindle Unlimited romance. So I recommend this book if you're curious about it. It is quite short. The contents of it would not be suitable for a longer book, but for a short book, this is a very enjoyable read just at how shocked you will be at 18th century literature. The next book I have is The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. This is the first Gothic novel ever. So Gothic literature existed before this novel. However, this is the first novel form of Gothic literature. So before this, we only had Gothic poems and Gothic short stories, but this is a novel. This is quite a short novel though. It could be classified as a novella because it is only about, maybe 80-ish pages. And so you are going to experience quite a few tropes in here. But remember, this is the first Gothic novel. So if the tropes feel familiar, they feel familiar because of this book. We have tons of really, really fun tropes in here. There is a big monster. Big being a key word, not to spoil anything, but there is a big monster. And there are hidden heirs, there's evil kings, there is peasants taking claims as rightful rulers, there are damsels in distress and damsels saving the male heirs, there are sword fight scenes, there are secret tunnels. Everything you want in a book is in this book, and it is short. So this is why this book is good for beginners. It's quite a short book. I will say the dialogue can sometimes be a little bit hard to follow in this book because there are no quotation marks. But once you get past that, just, read closely. It'll tell you when someone is saying something, there's just no actual quotation marks around that. But once you get used to that, this book is an easy read because it's so action-packed. So action-packed. So much happens in these 100 pages. And the last book I have to recommend is Agnes Gray by Anne Bronte. So the Bronte sisters, I love them. I absolutely love them. But some people, I already mentioned Jane Eyre at the beginning of this video, some people do have a little bit of struggle with their writing because it can be a little dense at times. So I think Agnes Gray is the easiest Bronte novel to devour. I actually read this book in one sitting. This is a story, oops, sorry, one of my pages is falling out. This is a story about a governess, and she falls in love with someone in this book, and she has really fucking terrible, sorry, I curse, but I feel strongly about this. The children in this novel are so annoying, but they're supposed to be annoying because you're supposed to see the plight of a governess. You're supposed to see, just similar to Jane Eyre, how terrible it is to be a governess during the Victorian era and how they are not supported by anyone. They're outcasts in every level of society, and it is hard and it is lonely, and children suck. So this book is one of the shorter Bronte novels as well. Anne Bronte is actually my favorite of the Bronte sisters because The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is probably my favorite classic book of all time. But Agnes Gray is definitely one of the easiest books to grab hold of because things happen pretty quickly, and the plot and the romance are the forefront of this book, not so much metaphors and flowery writing. The writing is beautiful in this, but just it's less the focus than some other Bronte novels. So I would recommend this if you want to try a Bronte novel, but you're kind of scared. And last but not least, I don't own a physical copy, but I am recommending Carmilla. This is a vampire novella that came before Dracula. So it is a novella, so it is quite short. I think it's about 60-ish pages. It could be a little bit shorter. But this is one of the first vampire stories, and it is lesbian. Has lots of lesbian vibes. So if you're wanting a queer vampire story, you can actually look back at this classic vampire tale of Carmilla, because Carmilla is so entertaining. It's so spooky. It's scary, but also sexy, and it's just a really good time. And Dracula is quite long. That's why Dracula is not like officially in this list, because it's hard to recommend a super long book to a beginner because you're gonna have to deal with that writing for a long time. Where Carmilla is so short that it's just quick. You can give it a quick read. The plot happens really fast because it is so short. So hopefully the denser writing won't hold you back from enjoying the story. But I absolutely loved Carmilla, and I think you would too. So those are all of my recommendations for classic books I think you should read. I think there's really something for everyone here. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe for more content. And if you decide to pick any of these up, let me know. I would be so curious to hear your thoughts on these classics. Let me know in the comments what your favorite classic you've read is, or if you don't like classics at all, let me know that too. I'm curious. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.